I use this sort of translating the world as my placeholder. I'm actually going to talk about a book I'm finishing. So it is now, yes, a little taste of it. It's tentatively called How to Write a Column. Since we live in an age where everyone wants to be a columnist, whether Facebook or Twitter or Reddit or whoever. So I thought I'd actually write about something I knew a lot about, which is how to write a column. The book is really about how I write, how I learn, how I connect dots. That's the first half, and the second half is about what I saw, because I've been doing this for 45 years. And I think we were all here for a really, really important transition. So, how did I get started as a journalist? I actually had that teacher. I had that teacher who changed his life. In 10th grade of high school, in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, we had a journalism teacher named Patty Steinberg, room 313 at St. Louis Park High School. And her journalism course is to this day the only journalism course I've ever taken. Not because I was that good, but because she was that good. And she pounded the fundamentals into us. Now, Hattie was 62 years old at the time, which I thought was literally a dinosaur quality. But now that I'm 71, I realize how young she was. But she was a woman of discipline. She taught you really to take words very seriously, to take reporting seriously. I still actually stand up a little straighter just remembering her. But she was a woman of great principle and standards in a very, uncertain time. But we hung around her classroom like it was the malt shop and she was Wolfman Jack. We were all attracted to that sense of principles and values. So she got me started, and then I actually got my first real article. I was on the high school newspaper, of course, and did a little in college, but I actually got my first article published in a real newspaper in 1975. Jimmy Carter was running against Gerald Ford for president, and I was a graduate student in London. And my then girlfriend, now wife, and I were walking down the street in London. And the Evening Standard, they have these sort of glaring headlines, the afternoon paper there, Brad to Jen, we're finished, kind of thing, to try to get you to buy the paper. And the blaring headline on the Evening Standard that day was, Carter to Jews, if elected, I promise to fire Dr. K. And I stopped my then girlfriend, now wife, and said, look at that headline, that's really interesting. Jimmy Carter's running for president, he's trying to win Jewish votes by promising to fire the first ever Jewish Secretary of State. That's really kind of interesting. And I have no idea what possessed me, but I went back to my dorm room and I wrote a column. My then girlfriend, now wife, a few weeks later took that column back home to Des Moines, Iowa, and walked it across the street to her neighbor Gilbert Cranberg, who was then the editorial page editor of the Des Moines Register, a great Midwest paper. And he liked it, and he printed it on a half page of the Des Moines Register with an Alf cartoon, and they paid me $50. And I thought that was the coolest thing in the whole world. I was walking down a street, I had an opinion, and someone paid me $50 for it. And I was basically hooked ever after. One of the first questions you have to ask yourself if you want to be an opinion writer is why write? Why make a living as a writer? It's not so easy. And I'd say I write for several reasons. The first and most important reason I write is to learn what I think. So I'm not a particularly strongly opinionated person. I don't come from a far left or far right background. And I write to discover. The way I've written all my books is I start out with an intuition. I think of it as a block of granite. Feels like the world's kind of flat. And then I start to chisel away, and I see an elbow and a knuckle and an ear, and I actually learn by writing. And it's an iterative process for me. So I come up with an idea, I pursue it, chisel away a little bit more. So the first reason I write is I write to learn. The second reason I write is I write to teach. When people ask me what I do for a living, I tell them I'm a translator from English to English. Okay, I like to take really complicated subjects break them down so I understand them, and then I can explain them to other people. Because I do live by Marie Curie's motto, now is the time to understand more so we may fear less. Now is the time to understand more so we may fear less. We live in a time of incredible complexity. And there's an entire industry out there trying to make people angry and stupid. And my form of idealism as a journalist is actually to try to be a good explainer on the assumption that if people understand more, they will fear less. Another reason I write is I write to bend. Martin Luther King famously said that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. But it doesn't bend by itself. You have to be in there to bend. And I consider myself a bender for the issues that I care about and feel I was came across a quote by a colleague who was in Ukraine, said, I had a feeling for the first time in the world that I knew, the first time that the world I knew, the world in which I grew up, the world I wanted to leave my children and grandchildren might collapse. And that is a feeling I've had a lot lately. And that is why I am in there bending. The last reason I write is, quite honestly, is because I need the eggs. You may remember the joke at the Woody Allen movie Annie Hall, where the guy goes to a psychiatrist and says, Doctor, I've got a terrible problem. My brother thinks he's a chicken. The doctor says, well, just tell him he's not a chicken. The guy says, I can't, I need the eggs. So there's something slightly irrational about this job. But I can tell you, I can be lying in bed at 2 in the morning, and I will, a lot of times columns write themselves from beginning to the end in my head. And I wake up. And what I do at 2 in the morning is I actually get out of bed, and I write that column up. I wait till about 8:15 to call my editor, Patrick Healy. He likes it, and he gets a copy editor and a fact checker. And by 2 in the afternoon on Sunday, it's shared with 12 million people around the world on NewYorkTimes.com. Friends, that is the most fun you can have legally that I know. Okay? You have an opinion, you write it up, and you get to share it with other people. And I'm not sure I will ever be able to survive without those eggs. Now, to be a columnist, you have to have a worldview. No one's interested in your reputations. And your worldview is a product of what I believe, how you learn and how you lead, and what you learn, but how you lead. Now, how I lead is very much influenced by the time and place I grew up. So I grew up in Minneapolis in the 1950s, and late 50s, and at the time, Minnesota politics, which was a long time ago, was famous for its moderation, and how much Republicans and Democrats worked together. In fact, I saw an Axios graph recently charting polarization in America from the 1890s to the present. The graph looks like way high in the 1890s. It absolutely hits its nadir of the most non-polarized period in the early 1950s, and then goes back up to the present. I was born right there at the nadir of polarization. And because of that, I really grew up with a feeling that politics can work and that people can work together. And that to this day infuses, what I write. I mean, it was just, I think back sometimes just the language of moderation I grew up with. There was a Jewish mafia in Minneapolis when I grew up, and my dad actually grew up with a lot of these guys. And when I was 5 or 6 years old, my dad came home and said to me that a friend of his had gone to jail. And like, when you're 5 years old and your dad knows someone who went to jail, like, that just freaked me out. And I said, Dad, what did he do? And he said, well, son, he was shopping in a store before it was open. That's Minnesota for breaking and entering. I was at a wedding factory before I wrote my last book, and I told this story to my friend Jay and his wife, and we sat down at the table, and they were a little flustered. His wife, Jay, said, Eileen was driving down Highway 100 on the way here, and a guy almost drove her off the road, and she was so mad she almost honked. That's Minnesota for road rage. Okay? So that's the time I grew up in. And as a result of that, It may be very much a both and person, not an either or person. And then it uses my rights in the place. So I'm for better police, add more police. I'm for a high wall on the border with a big gate. I'm for 2 states for 2 people. I want to redivide the pie and grow the pie. I'm a mean green. I believe in leveraging the market and Mother Nature. It's not because I haven't made up my mind. It's because I have. And I believe the synthesis is where the real energy is. So that sense of both and, not either or, started very early by where I grew up and when I grew up. How do I learn? And we all learn differently, so I have a chapter on how I learned. I wish I could say I did this 40 years ago when I started, 45 years ago. But this is all looking back. I realized I sort of had to develop a way of learning. And my method of learning is to go to the edge of 3 different realms, because it's at the edge where all the best learning happens. First of all, it's at the edge where you get to see things really startling, and it's at the edge where, if you're right, you actually get to name things. It feels like the world's a little flat out. Okay? So the 3 edges I went to was first the edge of human behavior. I lived in a civil war in Beirut for 5 years, from 1979 to 1984, pretty much. I don't know if there was a little bit in between. And living in a civil war, first of all, completely widened my aperture of human behavior. I got to see what humans were capable of by way of incredible evil and incredible kindness under extreme conditions. I got to see how human molecules behave at very high temperatures. And that was an enormous thing revealing to me and really helped shape my view of things. But Beirut also taught me to be an anthropologist as a journalist, because in Beirut, there was no data. There was no government of it. And when you live in a city with no data, you really have to be an anthropologist. So when I wanted to know what Lebanese felt, I didn't wait for the latest poll. I actually walked down the street and interviewed 20 people. And I developed a very anthropological approach to this day. If you're anywhere near my orbit, I will interview you. And I carry my notebook or computer around everywhere I go, because I think everyone has something to teach you. Because I was in a city with no data, though, I confessed this in my first book, From Beirut to Jerusalem. I'm not proud of it, but it's true. I started in Beirut with UPI, the wire service, and I was hired by the New York Times. When I worked for UPI, in those days, you had to file the worldwide weather highlights. Because we would pick up the paper and we want to know if you're going to Boston, Bangalore, Beirut, or Bangkok, what was the high and what was the low. But there was no weatherman that I knew of in Beirut, so I made up the weather report every day. How did you feel about that last night? Oh, Mr. Tom, kind of cool. Would you say 75? Yeah, 75. Low Beirut 75. How do you feel today? Oh, really hot, Mr. Tom. 87? Yeah, 87. That works good. And thus were the weather highlights filed in a city with no data. That was the first edge I went to, the edge of human behavior and anthropology. The second edge I went to is the edge of technology. Now I am, my title is Foreign Affairs columnist for the New York Times. But I developed a habit of learning about the world, not by just talking to diplomats, but by actually going to global companies who are in intense competition with each other and therefore need to be able to read the world very accurately if they're going to survive. So I would go to Walmart and to Amazon and Microsoft and lots of big companies. And I would say to their leadership, I just want to do 2 things here. I don't care about your stock price, your quarterly earnings, your next CEO, or your annual revenue. I just want to do 2 things. I want to hang out in your research lab. I want to know what's going on at the tippy tip of your spear. Because if you want to understand the future, hang out with people who are inventing it. And I want to spend time in your HR, your human resources department. I want to know how you're training your people for the world you're inventing, because I think that's coming to a borough college near me. Okay, and so that took me to all these companies where I found these people touching the edge of the story. One of them happened in 2004 in Bangalore, India, a company called Infosys, which at that point was the leading outsourcing company in the world. And I was doing a documentary then for the Discovery Channel, and I spent 2 weeks in Bangalore learning all about outsourcing, and it blew my mind to discover my My software was being written in Bangalore, and I lost luggage on Delta Airlines with the tickets from Bangalore. And my cartoons were being drawn in Bangalore. Anyways, the last interview was with Nandavi Lakhani, the CEO of Infosys. And I went to his office, and I had my laptop on my lap. We sat outside his office on a couch, but now there's a plaque on the wall. And while the crew set up the filming equipment in his office, and at one point he said to me, Tom, I've got to tell you, the global economic playing field is being leveled, and you Americans are not ready. Oh, I wrote that down on my little laptop. The global economic playing field is being leveled, and you Americans are not ready. We got done, I did the filming, did the interview, got back in my Jeep. It's about an hour's ride from Electronic City in Bangalore to the Leela Palace Hotel. And my way back, all the time, I'm rolling over in my head what he said, the global economic playing field is being leveled. It's almost like he's telling me it's being flattened. Oh my God. India's premier entrepreneur just told me the world is flat. And I wrote that down in my notebook, the world is flat. I got back to the Leela Palace, I ran up to my room, I called my wife in Bethesda and said, honey, I'm gonna write a book called The World is Flat. She now says she thought that was a brilliant idea. I don't remember the conversation exactly, but that idea came from hanging out at the edge of the story. The third edge I went to was the edge of environment. My wife was on the board of Conservation International, a great global environmental NGO, for 16 years, and with them I visited pretty much every great pristine ecosystem on the planet. The US Navy took me on an ice exercise on a submarine for 36 hours in the Arctic. I did some crazy, really cool stuff. And I did it first to learn about nature, because I didn't know much about nature. And then I did it to learn from nature. Because I came to understand and realize that the ecosystems that thrive when the climate changed were those that built complex adaptive networks with healthy interdependencies that made them much more adaptive, resilient, and productive. And that really shaped my thinking for the world we're going into, because I then came to realize that the communities that thrive when the climate technology changed and the climate change were those that built what I call complex adaptive coalitions with healthy interdependencies. Now, what nature does in building these networks, nature does it emergently and violently. The zebra eats the grass, the lion eats the zebra. What nature does emergently and violently, we actually have to do intentionally. Hold that thought, we'll get back to it. My design innovation was to take these three edges and then arbitrage them into a single 3D perspective on the world. So my motto is never think in the box, never think out of the box. Today you must think with out of box. And that out of box for me is these three different perspectives which I'm arbitraging all the time. So to show you how it works, I was the first person to point out that the Syrian civil war actually was begun by a climate event. So if you had, I graduated from Oxford and graduate school, I got a degree in Arabic and Middle East Studies in 1978. If you were to take that 1978 version of me and ask that version of me, what happened in Syria, in the 2010s, that version of me would have said, well, they had a coup, it was like when Adib Shishakli, through whoever. I've given you a very one-dimensional historical answer. When you ask this version of me 4 years later, this version of me will tell you that Syria had the worst drought in its modern history between 2006 and 2011. 1 million Syrian farmers and workers left their homes, blocked the city with overwhelming infrastructure. Assad did nothing for them. Then they got on their cell phones and watched the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt, and then they blew the lid off the place. It was the convergence of the market, Mother Nature, and Moore's Law, technology all together. And if you don't see it in 3D, you won't see the story. By the way, the Syrian Revolution began with 2 driest cities in the country, Dara and Qamishli. I don't think it was an accident. So that's how I learned, and that's the perspective I bring to things. What are the biggest lessons I've learned? I've been stuffing them in a shoebox for a long time, but I've got hundreds, but I'll just share with you a few. The number one lesson I've learned is that the 2 most powerful human emotions are humiliation and dignity. Which is why back in 2015, I actually changed my business card from New York Times Foreign Affairs columnist to New York Times humiliation and dignity columnist. Because basically all I do is cover people acting out on a sense of humiliation and questing for dignity. Whether it is China after a century of humiliation, described that way by China, Putin's Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Palestinians versus Israelis at checkpoints, you name it, I am the New York Times humiliation and dignity columnist. As Nelson Mandela once said, there's nobody more dangerous than one who has been humiliated. And there's no more dangerous cohort in the world today than young men who have never held a job, power, or a girl's hand. Young men who have never held a job, power, or a girl's hand are a really, really dangerous cohort, whether in China or Europe or America or the Middle East. Now, I personally, because I grew up in a wonderful community, don't have a lot of personal experience with humiliation. I'll just tell you that most humiliating experience I had was to go on Celebrity Jeopardy. I got my clock cleaned by Anderson Cooper. Incredibly humiliating. I didn't remember who invented the cotton gin or the Daily Double. But I am lucky in that regard. But the quest for dignity and the reaction to humiliation is an incredibly powerful force. The second big lesson I learned, and maybe the title of my book, is what you say when you listen. What you say when you listen. So I was a kind of a freaky kid. I was a Jewish kid from Minnesota who wanted to cover the airport in the 1970s. That was not a natural thing. And at the time, the New York Times had a rule: you couldn't be Jewish to go to Beirut or Jerusalem. And I broke both those molds. And I'm glad I did. But I didn't do it by going out there saying, "You're all great, you're all wonderful. It's all the other guy's fault." If you read my stuff, you know that's not me. I'm in everybody's face. But the way I've survived as a journalist out there for almost half a century is that I became a really good listener. Because two things happen when you listen. One is what you learn when you listen. So all the stories I got wrong were because I was talking when I should have been listening. But much more important is what you say when you listen. Because listening is a sign of respect. And it's amazing what people will let you say to and about them if they think you respect them. And if they don't think you respect them, you cannot tell them the sky is blue or it's nighttime out. So I really, I can go into a room, whether it's in China or the Middle East, with a group of young people. They got my columns spread out there. They're ready to carve me up. And I can spend an hour listening to them. And I mean deep listening, not just waiting for people to stop talking. And everyone at the end has their cell phone. I'm like, can I do a selfie with you? Because so many people just want to be heard and feel respected for. So that's really another huge important lesson I've learned. The last one, which I've written about before, is that in the history of the world, in the history of all mankind, no one has ever washed a rented car. Okay? I'm a big believer in that. In the history of the world, and there's some of the audience always come up and say, I washed a rented car. I get it, but I mean, most people have never washed a rented car. And most people have never washed a rented country. And most teachers have never washed a rented classroom. And most students, have never washed at their rented education. Ownership is everything. Where ownership is in the room, whether it's a student who owns their education, a teacher owns their classroom, a principal who owns their school, good things happen. And when ownership is not in the room, bad things happen. So I'm a big believer in ownership as well. I got another 50, but I won't bother with you with tonight. What's the biggest thing I saw? I'll finish by talking what's the biggest thing I saw, and what's the best thing I saw, and what's the worst thing I saw. So the biggest thing I saw, and this is about the time I've been columnist, is that we are here for a Promethean moment. So Prometheus was the Greek deity, the mythical deity who steals fire from on Olympus and uses it to humans to build civilization. And we know what these Promethean moments are. They're the invention of the printing press, the scientific revolution, the agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution, and right now. If you are here for something really, really big, you are Promethean moment. You know, when Gutenberg invented the printing press, some monk surely said to some priest, now that is really cool. You mean I don't have to write this Bible out longhand anymore? Okay. You are here, we are here for a similar moment. Only our Promethean moment is unique against all others for two reasons. One is it is not built on a single device like a steam engine or a printing press. It's actually built on a technology supercycle, the ability to sense, digitize, connect, process, learn, share, act, all amplified now by artificial intelligence. So it has feedback loops, and therefore it accelerates at a non-linear pace. I was just in San Francisco, an amazing moment. I took my 3.5-year-old grandson for the first time in a Waymo, a self-driving car, from our hotel to my daughter's house. And I have a picture of him sitting in the back seat, watching this car drive itself. And I can only think about 100 years from now, when he looks back at that picture the first time, you know, he drove in such a car. What is that car doing? It is sensing, it's digitizing, but it actually has, it has more senses than a human. It is sensing, it's digitizing, it's connecting, it's processing, it's learning, it's sharing, it's acting, and it's all amplified by AI. And therefore the feedback should get faster and faster. We're putting that process into your watch, into your toaster, and into your F-35 jet. It's going everywhere. What's also unique about our Promethean moment is it's paralleled by a climate supercycle. Emissions, warming, ice melt, change in wind currents, change in ocean currents, extreme weather. It too operates on feedback loops. And it goes around and around the same way. Basically what happened in the early 21st century is we hit a scaling point in silicon and we hit a scaling point in carbon at almost the exact same time. When you realize ChatGPT, they need to know what happened. One day one of the founders introduced a few words in Italian and it answered back in Italian. And they hadn't taught it Italian. They realized at that moment that it had reached a scaling point, that if you put enough neural networks together and enough training data, you actually got AI. It was an emergent phenomenon. The same thing happened in climate. When these things hit in the early 21st century, we humans experienced and actually ignited the second Big Bang. The first Big Bang was set off by our Creator millions of years ago. And the second Big Bang was set off by us. We became godlike in 3 different realms at the same time. We created an artificial brain larger and faster than the one we were endowed with by our Creator. No member of our species has ever done that before. We created connectivity that is global, and we can hear each other whisper now. We can hear each other whisper. At 7:15 this morning, I did a Zoom meeting with a group in Kiev, like we were next door, because we can now talk to each other, not at the speed of sound, but at the speed of light. We can now hear each other whisper globally. And lastly, we are the first species to ever drive itself from one climate epoch into another. From the Holocene, which we were in for 11,700 years, into the Anthropocene. We've become godlike in cognition, connectivity, and climate, all at the same time. Just one problem. We now have the power to part the Red Sea, but we don't have the 10 Commandments. Hold that thought for a second. So what this moment is doing is not changing the world. It's actually reshaping the world. We're going through a series of phase changes in a number of different realms, and you are all, and I, we're all living through this right now. Now, phase change you've learned from your physics class, which I know you all taken, basically says, you know, there's this thing called an ice cube, and the thing about phase change is they're enormously deceptive. That thing looks like an ice cube until the temperature hits a certain point and it immediately becomes water. And that water looks like water until the temperature reaches a certain point of phase change and it becomes steam. And we are now going through a series of phase changes in several realms, which I'll just very quickly share with you. We're going through a phase change in compute. So we used to generate compute by writing programs, algorithms, that instructed a computer to do a series of tasks that we instructed it to do. Of course, what AI is about is you just write one algorithm now, and the computer will forever after do all those tasks. That's a big phase change. We are also birthing in the process a superintelligence, a polymathic, artificially general intelligence is probably 3 to 5 years away. There's a lot of debate about that, but I think there's a consensus emerging that we're getting. What is polymathic artificial general intelligence? That's when you have a computer that has mastered biology, chemistry, physics, material science, Shakespeare, Mozart, and poetry better than a human, and then can reason across all of them at a high dimensional space, and therefore can see things no human could ever see. We're close to birthing a superintelligence being that is not carbon-based like we are, it's silicon-based, but it is something we are going to have to learn to collaborate with and get the best out of it and cushion the worst. That's triggering another phase change, what I call the first quadruple use technology. You've heard a lot about the term dual use. This came up in the Cold War, how a device can be either a tool or a weapon at the same time. So an iPhone in Ukraine could be used by grandma to call her grandson at the front, or used by grandma to call in an airstrike on the Russian tank in her backyard. Okay, that's called dual use. But once we have polymathic AGI, we will have a quadruple use technology. We can decide whether to use it to spread news around the world or spread viruses around the world that only kill people with the initials TF, okay? But it will soon in the next decade, be able to decide itself what it wants to do. That's quadruple use. And managing that is going to be extremely complex. In geopolitics, we're going through a phase change. When I speak about foreign policy now, I usually start my talk this way. I want to address all the parents involved. Mom, dad, if your son or daughter come home from Bard College and say, Mom and Daddy, I decided I'd like to be the Secretary of State one day. Tell them, honey, anything but that. You can be Secretary of Commerce, Agriculture, Education, HHS, but promise Mommy and Daddy, you won't try to be Secretary of State. Worst job in the world, okay, today. Why is that? Let's compare Henry Kissinger responding to a surprise attack in October 1973 with Tony Blinken responding to a surprise attack in the same neighborhood 50 years later, okay? So Henry Kissinger produces the first Arab agreements in 1973. What did Kissinger need? He needed 3 dimes. I'm dating myself here. He needed 3 dimes. 1 dime to call Golda Meir, 1 dime to call Hafez al-Assad, the president of Syria, 1 dime to call Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt. He needed 3 dimes, an airplane, 3 months of Kissinger magic, and he produced this amazing diplomatic breakthrough. He produced what I call an agreement of tic-tac-toe. 3 across: Egypt, Syria, Israel. Fast forward to Tony Blinken. Tony Blinken saw it double everywhere he went. He was dealing with inside Hamas and outside Hamas, political Hamas and military Hamas, Islamic Jihad and Hamas. The Israeli government was multi-fractured, hybrid. He had a Lebanese government that was Hezbollah and the Lebanese government. He had Syria, had Iran, Hezbollah, the Russians, and the Syrian government. In Iraq, he had Shia militias and the government. In Yemen, he had the Houthis and the government. He saw it double everywhere he went. His job was to take a Rubik's Cube and try to get all the colors aligned on one side of a Rubik's Cube. And if you've ever tried that, it's really hard. It ain't tic-tac-toe. Promise Mommy and Daddy, you won't try to be Secretary of State. Worst job in the world now, because the world is so polymorphic. In economics, we're going through an incredible phase change, which was the subject of my column today. We're going from thinking about the world as a set of discrete economies, the American economy, the Australian economy, the Chinese economy, the French economy, measured by their GDP, to a world, in fact, of ecosystems. The world today is not a set of discrete economies. That's a complete fiction, basically. And my teacher and friend, Feinhocker, had one explosive story in my column today. He called me up and just said this off the top of his head. He said, "You realize, Tom, no country today can make an iPhone." Think about that. Probably the most popular device in the world. And there's no country in the world that has the materials, the software, the manufacturing prowess to make an iPhone today. It's made by an ecosystem that literally spans 200 suppliers on 6 different continents. That's an ecosystem economy. Same is true of agriculture. Same is true how microchips are made. Now, the President of the United States currently doesn't understand this, but that is an incredible blessing. Now, the reason all these things are made by ecosystems is that they're complex. In fact, they're so complex that no one country can own the whole ecosystem. But complexity is a beautiful thing because complex devices answer complex problems, like the mRNA vaccine, which was also built by a global ecosystem. And the more complex answers we have to complex problems, the more our standard of living rises. It's a world today it's not the economy stupid, it's not ecosystem stupid. And making that adjustment is a big challenge for a lot of people. So in climate, we also go through a phase change. We're going from thinking about the climate problem as the climate, global warming, to polycrisis. Okay? So actually what's happening is climate change drives agricultural decline, drives internal migration, drives external migration, drives state collapse. That's polycrisis. You get this cascading effect. So the problem is no more climate or global warming. It's actually polycrisis. And societies are becoming more polymorphic. When I grew up in Minneapolis in the 50s, it was very binary. You're either black or white, you're either Jewish or Christian, you're either boy or girl, you're either worker or home, you're either work or the arts, you're in school or work. Everything was binary. That's now exploded in a wonderful way into a much more diverse and pluralistic environment. But each one of those shards is now empowered and connected. And so managing that becomes hugely difficult. So what do we call this here? What do we call this here? I struggled with it because I was born in the Cold War. I made my career mostly in the post-Cold War. And I knew that was over, in the last few years. So I started calling it the post-Cold War world. And then I woke up one day and said, that's really stupid, because this has nothing to do with the Cold War anymore. So the way I got the title was, during the summer, one of my tutors, Craig Lund, who was Chief Technology Officer at Microsoft, actually spent a week tutoring me on AI. And having as a tutor is fantastic, and been my tutor for a long time. And he's actually the one who introduced me to the term polymathic artificial general intelligence. And almost at the same time, I remember before or after, my climate tutor, Johann Rockstrom, who runs the Potsdam Climate Institute in Potsdam, Germany, called me and said, hey, would you come to New York for Climate Week? I've got a new book coming out, and if you come, you'll get some attention to do a seminar. I said, Johann, could do anything. What's your book called? He said, it's called Polycrisis. I said, well, isn't that interesting? My AI tutor is talking about polymathic artificial intelligence. My climate tutor is talking about polycrisis. My rap on the Secretary of State has got to deal with a world that's polymorphic and polyamorous. And basically, I called Craig one day and he said, well, I got the name of your ear. We're in the policy. We're in the policy. That's what is going on in this era. The world is being sharded into more and more little pieces. Each piece is getting empowered, and they're all connected. And managing it is going to be hell on wheels. But that's basically the era we're in, because the only way to govern this world now is no longer through a left-right grid, but actually through complex adaptive coalitions. The only way you manage this world is the way nature does it, horizontally, and not from the top down. Basically what's happened is that if you think about the last World War III, everything. That means that the Industrial Revolution was enormously destabilizing. We finally figured out a way to do it with something called the welfare state. You had a Chinese communist version, a Russian communist version, a Western European social democracy version, and an American New Deal version. And the welfare state was basically a set of walls, ceilings, and floors that would enable workers to get the best out of the Industrial Revolution, pushing the worst. And the debate, the political debate, was a left-right grid over how high the walls should be. Left said high walls, protection, right said low walls. How thick the floor, the safety net should be. Left said thick floor, right said thin floor. And how tight the ceiling should be. The ceiling was on the pace of change and incomes. Left said low ceiling, right said no ceiling. Same debate, 75 years, left-right grid, been the same party for all these years, all these countries. And then one day, kaboom, my big bang happens, and we blow up the ceiling, blow down the walls, and crash through the floor. And suddenly these left-right parties are not fit for purpose anymore. So the Tories, a traditional business foreign policy party, become a Brexit party. I have to tell you what happened to the Republicans. I have no clue who governs Italy today, but I don't think it's Christian Democrats, okay? And Germany keeps changing now parties and governments, by the year. That's because the whole grid blew up, and we're now feeling our way to a new way of governing the world, which has to be through complex adaptive coalition. Let me give you a simple example. I'm in Israel in 2019, and I run into Amnon Shashua, who runs Mobileye, an Israeli autonomous driving company that Intel bought for $14 billion. He says, have you ever driven an autonomous vehicle? I said, I was just at Google in Mountain View, California, and I rode in their Waymo. It's 2019. He said, no. That's a grid. Try driving a self-driving car in Jerusalem where there are no two parallel streets. So I said, I'll do that twice. I go up to Jerusalem, we ride in his car up, down, around, all over the city. No one's driving. It blew my mind. Well, afterward, we sat down and said, Tom, to test a self-driving car in Israel, you need an insurance protocol that determines what constitutes safe self-driving. Otherwise, anyone you hit or anyone hit you, you would get sued. Well, that was a little deep for the rabbis who run Jerusalem. So Amnon had to convene a complex adaptive coalition of Volkswagen, their car supplier, Mobileye engineers, the rabbis who run Jerusalem, the Israeli Ministry of Transportation, and they actually collaboratively wrote a law together. It's so good that Yandex, Russia's Google, started testing their self-driving cars in Israel, and China just took the whole Israeli law, translated it into Chinese, and made it their law. Who is left and who is right in that story? There is no left. There is no right. There's just a completely new problem driven by a completely new supercycle in technology. And it can only be answered by complex adaptive coalitions. And that brings me to my conclusion. The best thing I saw and the worst thing I saw in my career. The best thing I saw in my lifetime, this surprises people always. I believe the best thing that happened in my lifetime was the creation of the European Union. Now, I know, Americans will do anything for the EU except read about it, okay? But when you think about it for a second, you realize that a continent known for tribal, religious, and ethnic wars, national wars, from time immemorial, the last three, the Cold War, World War I, World War II, we had to go for help 12. Raised the largest center of free markets, free people, little human rights ever. That is an amazing feat. I happen to believe it is one of mankind's greatest creations. We are the lucky generation who gets to live in a world of two United States, not just one. It's not as coherent as ours, but it is nevertheless an amazing amount. And the many things that drive me nuts about Donald Trump is that his goal is to break up the European Union, one of mankind's greatest creations. I believe that is the best thing to happen in my life. And you would not want to live in the world anymore without a European Union. It is our wingman of the world. What's the worst thing that happened? Well, the worst thing that happened in my life is we lost our mangroves. Now, I'm going to skip this. So that is a mangrove. Now, I grew up in Minnesota, as I said. I didn't know a lot about mangroves. But mangroves are these amazing plants in nature that do four functions. First, they filter toxins and pollutants in the water through their root system, incredibly complex cable roots. Second, they hold the shore in place. Third, they buffer storms, so the towns in Aceh and Indonesia who took out their mangroves got swamped, and those who kept their mangroves didn't. And lastly, they create nurseries for young fish will probably, because the cable fish are so hard that large predator fish can't get into them. So mangroves provide this incredible function, and the worst thing that happened in my lifetime is that we lost our mangroves. But not just in nature. You see, it used to be a mangrove that if you had unprotected sex with a stripper, a month after your wife gave birth to your son, you wouldn't be running for president anymore. That was a mangrove. That was a filter. Local newspapers were mangrove. Barack Obama tells a wonderful story when he ran for president. He started in Southern Illinois, and he would actually go to small towns and meet with their editors. Usually conservative and usually a white guy. And Obama would spend an hour talking to this person, and after the hour, that editor would say, you know, black guy's okay. Black guy's okay. I'm going to endorse the black guy. Okay? Well, today, that editor's gone, that newspaper's gone, and it goes right from Fox or MSNBC to your living room with no mangrove. Elite responsibility was the mangrove. It used to be that if your husband was on the Supreme Court, you wouldn't actually be emailing the White House chief of staff to overturn the last election, okay? Because you'd be so proud that your husband was on the Supreme Court that you had a sense of limits, okay? We have lost our mangroves. And that is a huge destabilizing effect, right when we need actually to be weaving them together in complex adaptive coalitions. That is the worst thing that happened in my career. What's the most hopeful thing? Well, I don't leave on a downer. So, the Washington Post in 2019, they were running that during the time of COVID. They had a section called Good News. They had a special section, Good News, okay? So, Christmas 2019, they had a story about this town Rockford between Baltimore and Washington. And a story about a man who was stringing his Christmas lights one day. And he decided on the spur of the moment, his neighbor across the street, recently off her husband, he knew she was depressed and lonely because of COVID. And on the spur of the moment, he strung his